The year was 1888. The place, the unforgiving flatlands of the Dakota Territory, a few miles south of the Canadian border. And the man was Elias Thorne, a quiet farmer whose neighbors had decided with near unanimous certainty that he had lost his mind. They watched him in late November when the first true deep freeze had locked the land. He wasn't mending fences or insulating his cabin. He was down at Miller's Pond with a team of tired horses and a set of enormous wicked-looking saws. He was harvesting ice. This itself was not unusual. Every homesteader laid up a store of ice in a sawdust-packed shed for the summer. But Elias wasn't cutting neat, manageable blocks for the ice house. He was wrestling out colossal slabs, 2 feet thick and 6 feet long, each one weighing the better part of a ton. And he wasn't hauling them to his ice house. He was dragging them, one by one, on a heavy stone boat, to his barn. There, he stacked them. He leaned them against the north and west walls, the ones that took the full, uninterrupted fury of the winter wind. By the 1st of December, his simple wooden barn was encased on 2 sides by a rough, glittering rampart of solid pond ice. It was a sight so bizarre, so contrary to all known logic, that it became the primary topic of conversation at the trading post. They called it Thorne's Folly. Some, more poetically, named it the Glacier Barn. The consensus was simple. The man was trying to freeze his own livestock to death. What did this quiet outsider, this man who had only arrived from Michigan 2 years prior, understand about survival that every hardened, experienced Dakota farmer had missed? The answer, it would turn out, was everything. So if you believe that sometimes the most radical ideas come from the simplest truths, hit that subscribe button and stay with me. This is a story about the difference between cold and the wind that carries it. To understand the genius of what Elias Thorne was doing, you must first understand the enemy. In the Dakota Territory, the enemy was not the temperature. A man could dress for 10 below zero. A cow with enough feed could withstand it. The true killer was the wind. It was a living thing. A relentless, soul-stealing pressure that never, ever stopped. It came screaming down from the Arctic, with nothing to slow it. No hills, no forests, just 1,000 miles of frozen prairie to gain speed. It was a wind that could strip the heat from a living body in minutes, a phenomenon the old-timers knew in their bones but lacked the words to describe. They didn't call it wind chill. They called it the razor. And it was this razor that destroyed their barns. The standard barn of the era was a testament to good, honest carpentry. It was built from thick planks of pine or oak, with heavy beams and a steep roof to shed the snow. In Ohio or Pennsylvania, such a barn was a fortress. In Dakota, it was a sieve. The wind found every imperfection. It screamed through the tiny gaps between planks, no matter how well seasoned or tightly fitted. It forced its way under the eaves and through the door frames. These weren't gentle drafts. They were jets of super-chilled air that cut through the barn's interior like knives. The results were catastrophic. Livestock would huddle on the downwind side, shivering violently, their bodies burning precious calories just to fight the cold. A farmer could double their winter feed, and the animals would still grow thin and weak. Water troughs would freeze solid within an hour of being filled. A cow that lay down in the wrong spot could have its ears or tail frostbitten overnight. Calves born during a cold snap had almost no chance of survival. The air inside the barn was a swirling, miserable chaos of frigid air the smell of animal fear, and the constant high-pitched shriek of the wind. Every farmer fought the same losing battle. They stuffed the cracks with rags and mud, a task that had to be repeated after every storm. They hung horse blankets over the walls, which soon became stiff with frost. They burned through their firewood at an unsustainable rate, just to keep their own cabins livable, leaving little for any kind of warming effort in the barn. They accepted the death of 10 to 15% of their herd each winter as a grim, unavoidable cost of living on the prairie. But Elias Thorne had not grown up on the prairie. He had spent 20 years working the great ice harvests on Lake Huron. He was not a farmer who happened to be cutting ice. He was an iceman who had taken up farming. His entire adult life had been spent observing the properties of frozen water. He knew things that others didn't. He knew that a foot of clear, solid ice was a surprisingly poor conductor of heat, far better than a foot of stone. He knew that its true power was its density, its utter impermeability. Air could not pass through it, not a molecule. While a wooden wall was a porous filter, a wall of ice was a solid dam. Most importantly, he understood the concept of thermal mass. He had seen how the vast, deep ice of the Great Lakes resisted changes in temperature. It took months of summer sun to melt it, and months of winter cold to form it. Ice, he knew, was a great stabilizer. It was a flywheel for temperature. He watched the prairie wind tear at the wooden barns and saw the problem not as a lack of insulation, but as a failure of mass. He wasn't trying to build a warmer wall. He was trying to build a calmer one. The construction began with an act that only added to his reputation for madness. He built a second, flimsy outer wall. Using cheap, rough-cut lumber, he erected a simple frame that stood 3 feet away from his barn's north and west walls. It was barely a skeleton, just enough to hold back the immense weight that was to come. Then came the ice. The work was brutal, punishing, and cold. With long 2-man saws, he and his eldest son cut channels in the surface of the pond, then sawed off the massive blocks. They used heavy iron tongs, attached by chains to a harness on their sturdiest horse, to grip the blocks and drag them from the water, up a ramp of packed snow, and onto the stone boat. The journey to the barn was slow and treacherous. Each block was a monster of translucent blue-green, weighing over 1,500 pounds. Getting them into the 3-foot gap between the barn and the new frame was a feat of simple machines and raw strength. They used a low ramp and a system of levers and rollers, slowly nudging each slab into place. He worked with the precision of a stonemason, fitting the blocks tightly against one another. He sealed the joints not with mortar, but with a slurry of snow and water. He would pack the crevices with wet snow, and within minutes the Dakota air would freeze it solid, welding the blocks into a monolithic, seamless wall. By the time he was done, his barn was shielded by a barrier of solid ice more than 10 feet high and nearly 2 feet thick. It was during this process that he received his most notable visitor. Magnus Bjornsson was the community's undisputed authority on construction. A Norwegian immigrant who had been building on the prairie for 20 years, his cabins were the tightest, his barns the strongest. He built with an old-world reverence for wood and a deep, practical understanding of how to fight the cold. He approached Elias not with mockery, but with genuine professional concern. "Thorne," he said, his voice a low rumble, his beard frosted with his own breath. "I have held my tongue, But I must ask what you are doing." Elias stopped his work, wiping his brow with a woolen mitten. "Trying to keep the wind off my animals, Mr. Bjornsson." Magnus gestured at the wall of ice with a thick, calloused hand. His objections were not foolish. They were grounded in sound building principles. "This is a wall of cold. You have built a refrigerator around your barn. The frost from this will leach through your wood and make it even colder inside." Elias shook his head slightly. "I don't think so," Magnus pressed on, his tone that of a teacher trying to correct a stubborn student. "And what happens when a Chinook wind blows for a day? Or when the sun shines in February? This ice will sweat. It will weep. All that water will pool at your foundation. By spring you will have a swamp, and your sill plates will be rotten. You are trading a winter problem for a spring disaster." It was a perfectly logical argument. Every farmer knew the damage that meltwater could do. Elias considered this for a moment. He looked at the massive solid wall, then back at the respected builder. "It's just to stop the air from moving," he repeated, his voice quiet but firm. "The rest is just details." Magnus Bjornsson stared, his frustration clear. He saw a man committing a series of catastrophic errors, and he could not make him understand. He shook his head slowly, a look of pity on his face, and walked away. The verdict was in. The expert had confirmed what everyone else suspected. Elias Thorn was a fool. The mockery at the trading post intensified. Men would laugh and speculate on how long it would take for Thorn's cattle to become blocks of frozen beef. The nickname, the Ice Folly, stuck. Children would dare each other to run up and touch the glittering wall. Thorn became a social outcast, a man whose stubborn ignorance was a source of communal amusement and concern. But inside his workshop, Elias was completing the final, crucial step. He boarded up the top of the 3-foot gap between the ice and the barn, creating a sealed, captive space. He had not built an ice wall, he had built an air trap. Here is the physics of what the prairie farmers could not see. The single greatest thief of heat in a cold climate is convection, the movement of air. Wind doesn't make the air colder. It simply replaces the thin layer of warmth your body, or a barn, generates with new, cold air over and over again at a furious rate. A wooden wall full of microscopic cracks and seams allows that wind to penetrate, to keep the process of convective heat loss going right inside the building. Elias Thorn's ice wall was the ultimate windbreak. Being a solid, non-porous mass, it was absolutely impermeable to air. The most ferocious Arctic gale would hit that wall and stop. It could not pass through. This created a 3-foot wide pocket of completely trapped, unmoving air. And still, air is one of the most effective insulators on the planet. The principle is the same as a double-pane window, or the feathers of a bird, or the wool of a sheep. It's not the material itself that insulates so well. It's the tiny pockets of air it traps. Elias had created a massive 3-foot-thick air pocket around his barn. The ice wall's job was simply to protect that pocket of still air from the wind. The ice itself would be brutally cold, yes. Its outer surface would be the same temperature as the ambient air, but its immense thermal mass meant it would conduct that cold inward very, very slowly. The trapped air, meanwhile, would be warmed slightly by the tiny amount of heat escaping through the wooden walls of the barn from the bodies of the animals inside. This created a stable, thermal buffer zone. The barn was no longer fighting a -20-degree wind. It was sitting in a calm, protected space where the temperature might be a steady 5 or 10 degrees. The wind's power to steal heat had been utterly and completely neutralized. He hadn't built a refrigerator. He had built an engine of stillness. December came, and with it, the first real tests. The temperature dropped to 0, and the wind howled for days. Neighbors watched Thorne's chimney, expecting to see it belching smoke constantly as he tried to keep his family from freezing. But it puffed along at a normal rate. They listened for the sounds of distressed cattle. They heard nothing. The ice folly stood silent and impassive. A thin layer of drifting snow collected at its base, smoothing its connection to the frozen earth. It looked less like a human construction and more like a feature of the landscape, ancient and untroubled. Then January came, and with it, the storm that would pass into legend. It began not with snow, but with a change in the quality of the light. The sky took on a strange, gray, metallic sheen. The air grew unnaturally still, a silence that felt heavy and menacing. The old-timers saw it and felt a primal dread. They called it the weather breeder, a calm that promised violence. On the morning of January 12, 1889, the temperature at dawn was 5 degrees above 0. By noon, it was 10 below. By sunset, it had plunged to 30 below 0, and the wind had arrived. It was not a gale. It was a physical assault. A solid wall of moving air that meteorologists would later estimate at over 70 miles per hour. It picked up the loose snow from the prairie and turned the world into a churning, horizontal blizzard of white. Visibility dropped to 0. To step outside your door was to be instantly blinded and disoriented. This was the storm that would be called the Great White Hurricane, and it brought the Dakota Territory to its knees. Inside the conventional barns, it was a scene from a nightmare. The wind shrieked through the walls, a sound like tearing metal. The fine flour-like snow was driven through every crack, coating the animals' backs with a layer of white rime. Drafts cut through the interior, dropping the effective temperature to 50 or 60 below 0. Farmers fought desperately to save their animals. They hammered boards over cracks, only to have the wind rip them away. They tried to stretch canvas, which was shredded in minutes. The livestock, panicked and freezing, pressed together in a terrified mass, sometimes crushing the weaker ones. Water barrels, filled from wells, froze solid before the animals could even drink. The farmers were helpless, trapped in their cabins, listening to the sounds of their livelihoods being destroyed. Magnus Bjornsson, the master builder, suffered with the rest. His barn, the pride of the county, was failing. The wind, a force of unimaginable pressure, was literally bowing the western wall inward. He could hear the groaning of the massive timbers that he himself had set. He and his sons spent hours trying to nail blankets over the worst of the drafts, their fingers growing numb and useless in the frigid interior. The fine snow blew in so thick it looked like smoke. His prize-winning bull, a magnificent Hereford he had spent a fortune on, began to stumble, its breath coming in ragged, steaming gasps. Magnus knew the signs. The animal's lungs were freezing. There was nothing he could do. By the second morning of the storm, the bull was dead, frozen solid in a standing position. Magnus felt a despair so profound it was a physical sickness. His expertise, his knowledge, his traditions, they were all useless against this power, and in his misery, a thought burrowed into his mind. Thorne. The fool with the ice wall. What was happening in his barn? Magnus imagined a scene of utter horror, a barn encased in a tomb of ice, the animals inside long dead, frozen statues in the dark. A grim sense of responsibility gnawed at him. He had dismissed the man. He had not intervened. He imagined Thorn's wife and children, and a wave of guilt washed over him. By the third day, the wind had not slackened. Magnus knew that if Thorn's family was in trouble, they would be long past helping themselves. Wrapped in every piece of wool and fur he owned, he tied a rope from his cabin door to his own barn, then from his barn in the direction of the Thorn homestead, a quarter-mile away. He would follow the fence line. It was a suicidal journey, but he had to know. The journey was a battle for every foot. The wind hammered him, trying to tear him from his feet. The air was so cold it burned his lungs. The snow was not falling. It was a horizontal river, scouring the landscape. He couldn't see the fence posts until he was right on top of them. More than once he fell, the wind threatening to bury him in a drift. But he pushed on, driven by a grim cocktail of guilt and a sliver of professional curiosity. He almost missed the barn entirely. It didn't look like a building. It was a huge white mound, a natural drift that had swallowed a structure. There were no sharp angles, just smooth, wind-sculpted curves of snow. And there was no sound. The shrieking of the wind seemed to be muffled, dampened. There were no panicked animal cries, no groaning wood, just an unnerving, profound silence. He stumbled to the large eastern door, the one sheltered from the wind, and banged on it with a frozen fist. He expected no answer. He was preparing to force the door, to face the grim tableau he was sure lay within. The door scraped open. Elias Thorn stood there, holding a lantern. He was in his shirt sleeves. Magnus Bjornsson stared, uncomprehending. Behind Thorn, in the warm yellow light of the lantern, he could see the barn's interior. But something was wrong. It was the wrongness that broke his mind. It was the silence. The first thing that hit him was not a wave of warmth, but a wave of absolute, profound stillness. The 70-mile-per-hour hurricane that was raging just outside the door simply stopped. It did not exist in this space. The air was dead calm. Elias pulled him inside and shut the door, the world of noise and fury vanishing as if it had never been. Magnus stood there, snow-caked and trembling, his mind struggling to process the sensory information. He smelled sweet hay and the warm, earthy scent of cattle. He heard the soft, rhythmic sound of cows chewing their cud. He looked at the animals. They were not huddled. They were not shivering. They were standing peacefully in their stalls, some even lying down on the straw bedding, looking utterly placid. A few chickens scratched in the aisle, unconcerned. His gaze traveled up to the hayloft. Thorn's 2 young children were sitting on a pile of hay, playing with a litter of newborn kittens, their laughter echoing softly in the vast, calm space. They wore no coats. Magnus, the master builder, began to investigate. He was a man whose world had just been turned upside down, and he fell back on his trade to make sense of it. He walked to the western wall, the one facing the full fury of the storm. He placed his bare hand against the wooden planks. It was cool. It was merely cool to the touch. It was not caked with frost. It did not radiate a killing cold. He ran his hand along the seams between the boards, the very seams that in his own barn were screaming like banshees and spitting snow. He felt nothing, not the slightest whisper of a draft. He looked at the water trough. It was full of liquid. A thin skim of ice was on the surface, but it was not frozen solid. He looked at Thorn's small pile of cordwood stacked against the wall. It was barely touched. Finally, his professional pride shattered. His worldview in ruins, he turned to Elias Thorn. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "How many have you lost?" Elias looked at him, his expression not of triumph, but of simple, weary fact. "Lost? None, not a one. The brown cow even calved yesterday morning. Mother and baby are fine." He pointed with his chin toward a nearby stall. Magnus looked and saw a newborn calf nestled in the hay, sleeping peacefully at its mother's side. The sight was so impossible, so contrary to the laws of nature as he understood them, that it felt like a physical blow. In his own state-of-the-art barn, his prize bull was a frozen statue. Here, a newborn calf was sleeping. The numbers were undeniable. The proof was living and breathing all around him. He had lost his strongest animal. Elias hadn't lost his weakest. Magnus walked back to the center of the barn, his boots silent on the straw-covered floor. He looked at the calm animals, the playing children, the man in his shirt sleeves. He looked at the solid, silent walls. The full, crushing weight of his arrogance, of his community's mockery, fell upon him. He had not just been mistaken. He had been profoundly, fundamentally, and dangerously wrong. He faced Elias Thorn, and in the quiet of the barn, surrounded by the evidence of a truth he had refused to see, he spoke the hardest words a man like him could ever say. "I was wrong," Magnus said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thorn, I was completely wrong. This is a miracle." He paused, his gaze sweeping the interior one more time. "You must show me. As a builder, I have to understand." Elias simply nodded. He led Magnus to a small door he had built into the eastern wall, a door that opened not to the outside, but into the 3-foot gap between the wood and the ice. He opened it and gestured for Magnus to step inside. Magnus entered the buffer zone. The air was frigid, but absolutely, perfectly still. He stood in a narrow corridor of ice and wood. He reached out his left hand and touched the inner face of the ice wall. It was so cold it felt like it burned his skin. He reached out his right hand and touched the outer face of the wooden barn wall. It was degrees and degrees warmer, merely cool. And in that moment, standing between the two walls, feeling the massive temperature differential, the entire principle became clear to him not as a theory, but as a physical reality. The ice took the punishment of the wind. The air gap provided the insulation. It was brutally simple. It was utterly brilliant. He had been so focused on the properties of the ice, he had completely missed the power of the air. When the great white hurricane finally blew itself out, it left behind a landscape of devastation and grief. Every farmer in the region had lost livestock. Some had lost their entire herds, their financial futures wiped out in 3 days of wind. The stories of loss and hardship would be told for generations, but one story spread faster and with more urgency than any other. It was the story Magnus Bjornsson began to tell, with the zeal of a convert. He told everyone who would listen about Thorn's folly. He described the calm, the quiet, the living calf. He, the most respected builder in the territory, became the chief advocate for the very idea he had once ridiculed. He explained the principle with a carpenter's clarity. "The ice is not the wall," he would say, sketching designs on the floor of the trading post with a piece of charcoal. "The ice is the shield. The wall is the air." Thorne did not build a wall of ice. He built a wall of stillness. That next autumn, a strange new activity took hold. No fewer than a dozen farmers, guided by Magnus and coached by a quietly accommodating Elias Thorne, began constructing their own ice windbreaks. They followed the method, building the outer frame and then hauling the great slabs from the frozen ponds. Thorne walls, they were now called, the name spoken with a new tone of respect. The following winter was harsh, as all Dakota winters were. But for the families with Thorne walls, it was different. Their barns were quieter. Their feed piles lasted longer. Most importantly, their losses were drastically reduced. The idea was proven not just in a freak storm, but in the day-to-day grind of a normal winter. Within 5 years, the ice windbreak had become the standard for any barn built on the open prairie. It transformed the economics of ranching in the region. Men who had been on the verge of bankruptcy were now stable. The annual winter cull of livestock, once accepted as inevitable, became a rarity. Elias Thorne never sought fame or fortune from his idea. He continued to farm his land, a quiet, respected member of the community he had inadvertently taught how to survive. When people asked him how he came up with the idea, he would just shrug. "The wind was the problem," he'd say, "so I stopped the wind." The real impact wasn't measured in degrees, or cords of wood, or even in the number of cattle saved. It was measured in human dignity. It was measured in the peace of mind of a farmer who could sleep through a blizzard without fearing ruin. It was measured in the safety of a family who no longer saw winter as an annual threat to their very existence. It was measured in the quiet confidence of a community that had learned to face its greatest enemy, not with brute force, but with a quiet, elegant, and profoundly clever idea. The story of Elias Thorne and his glacier barn is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most effective solutions are counterintuitive. It shows that established wisdom, no matter how deeply entrenched, must sometimes yield to a new perspective. The expert isn't always the one with the most experience in a place, but the one whose experience allows them to see the problem in a fundamentally new way. The core principle of the Thorne wall, creating a dead airspace protected by an outer sacrificial layer, is a cornerstone of modern construction. We see it today in the ventilated facades and rain screens of high-tech buildings. It is a testament to the idea that the laws of physics are timeless, and a good idea, born of observation and necessity, will never truly go out of style. This narrative is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While based on real historical principles of passive heating, thermal mass, and insulation used by pioneers, the specific characters, names, and events depicted are products of imagination. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.